Hi, and welcome to the Truth to Power podcast with William Roberts. Today we're talking to Raj Bhala, who's going to help explain what's going on with President Donald Trump's on again, off again tariff policies. Raj is the Brenneson Distinguished Professor of International Trade Law at University of Kansas School of Law. He has a master's from the London School of Economics and another in Industrial Relations from Oxford. He earned his law degree at Harvard. And among his many publications, Raj is the author of the 2024 book, Trade War, Causes, Conduct, and Consequences of Sino-American Confrontation, a timely topic. Raj is also the author of the International Trade Law textbook set, which runs 8 volumes and more than 6,000 pages. Thankfully, it's free and open access on KU Scholar Works. Raj, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on the program. It's always great to work with you. I always learn a lot from your questions and comments, and especially to do this inaugural Truth to Power podcast is fantastic. So thank you.
Thank you. You're very kind. I will say you are truly an expert on international trade law and someone I've learned a lot from also and relied on a lot in the last couple of years to understand what's going on with U.S. trade policy. I'm delighted you're able to join us on this inaugural episode. Honored to have you.
Thank you.
So we knew when Trump won the election to a second presidential term that he would impose new tariffs. He talked about it during the campaign. And you predicted it would be a chaotic process. I'm not sure we realized then how chaotic. On April 2nd, what the president called Liberation Day, he announced across the board tariffs on just about every product imported into the U.S. from just about every country in the world. And he threatened, but withheld, reciprocal tariffs that would punish major U.S. trading partners for running trade surpluses with the U.S. The reaction in financial markets was not friendly. In fact, I think the U.S. stock market briefly tanked in April on fear that the tariffs would spark a worldwide recession. Now, Trump has retreated from the ledge and markets have bounced back and they seem somewhat complacent. My question for you is, should they be?
They should not be. Markets should not be complacent at all. The long run prospects, not only for the economy of the United States and the world, but the legal system in the U.S. and around the world are deeply problematic. Let me explain why I say that. The first 100 days, which presidents often like to be benchmarked by, of the second Trump administration, so specifically the 20th of January, 2025, Inauguration Day, through the 29th of April of 2025 have been the most disruptive period in the history of the modern multilateral trading system. That means they've been the most disruptive period in the world trading system since the signing of GATT on the 30th of October, 1947, GATT being, of course, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And these first 100 days have also been the most disruptive period in our regional, our continental architecture, that is, since the 1st of January, 1994, when NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, in its first iteration, entered into force. The president's actions, his trade policy, his America First trade policy, which he signaled with his America First memorandum on Inauguration Day, they have shattered all of the substantive and stylistic norms that we have been used to in these last 80 years and these with GATT and these last 30 years with NAFTA. And so if markets are trading only on short-term up and down, that as it's sometimes called the taco trade, that Trump always chickens out, that so markets go down when he announces tariffs because then they expect recession or possibility of recession, and then they go up a day later.
Or one for Raj for calling the taco trade first in this podcast.
Yeah. Then in an intraday sense or a couple of days sense, they're really not focusing on the long term. And let me put it in 2 words what I think this long term is. And I don't think we've seen a long term like that since the 1930s. And I call it xenophobic autarky. It's also been called by the Financial Times capitalism in one country. Now, what either phrase means, xenophobic autarky or capitalism in one country, it means that foreigners, foreign sources of supply for imports, finished merchandise, inputs, cannot be trusted, friend or foe. In fact, friends are foes because they're competing with American companies and American employees. And the autarky part, autarky, that economic term, which has nothing to do with autocracy, it's an economic term, means really self-reliance, no trade. So you put the two together, the policy that's underlying in these first 100 days, all of the tariffs we're going to talk about, the different kinds, is really to onshore or reshore as much production as possible and not engage in international trade. That's the autarky part. And the reason is that foreigners are untrustworthy. And that's, again, in the FT perspective, that's capitalism in one country. Now, if you are trading in the markets in Wall Street, name me stock markets anywhere in the world across the last several decades that do really well under those closed economy conditions. In fact, if we think about it, the entire history of post Second World War development economics, theory and practice, study after study shows that open economies perform better than closed economies. They perform better in terms of sustained rates of growth per capita gross domestic product. And economists measure open economies with different benchmarks, like what percentage of the economy is accounted for by imports or exports. And there are always some quibbles about the econometrics. But the consensus is clear. Study after study, including World Bank studies, studies by famed economists like Jeffrey Sachs and Kruger, they all make it plain that open economies perform better in terms of the rate of growth of per capita GDP on a sustained period. Well, why would you be complacent then if you're on Wall Street saying, well, the markets are up today, the tariffs are not going to be a problem? I think that's wrong.
Trump announced 50% tariffs last week, and he signed the order yesterday imposing this 50% ad valorem tariff on steel and aluminum imports to the U.S. Canada is the largest exporter of steel to the U.S., followed by Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and Vietnam. It's also the largest supplier of aluminum. China is the second largest supplier of aluminum, and China is one of the world's largest producers of steel for other markets. 50% is a really high tariff. And Trump said in his speech, the 25% tariff that he put in place in February was high, but not stopping the imports to the U.S. And his rationale is this is going to help the U.S. steel industry. He announced it in connection with the approval of the Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel. But everybody in the manufacturing sector is looking at this saying this is crazy because our costs now are going to, first of all, we can't get supply in the U.S. And secondly, if we were to be able to, it'd be very expensive. And it just seems almost counterproductive. If your goal is to promote manufacturing in the United States, why would you raise the basic cost of things like steel with a 50% tariff?
Well, I agree with you entirely. First, there's several great pieces to your question. So let me kind of peel them off one by one. First, China as a supplier. In 2024, though China is the world's largest steel producer, China accounted for only 1.8%, less than 2% of total US steel imports. And as far as aluminum goes, we have in the US a small smelting capacity. We only account for about 1.73% of global smelter capacity. So we do import about 50% of our aluminum. But as you rightly said, the vast majority of our imports come from Canada. And Canadian importers are twice those of the next 9 countries combined. And following Canada are the UAE and China. So here again, the point is the statistical picture with respect to aluminum, like steel, in terms of dependence on China, just isn't there. The real problem, which the administrations, Biden and Trump, have not addressed, is overcapacity in the Chinese steel and aluminum industry. The idea that a global accord, or at least a plurilateral accord, maybe under the auspices of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or possibly the World Trade Organization, to somehow manage trade and production in steel and aluminum is going to be what's needed. And as we all know, that's going to require addressing the nexus between Chinese Communist Party power politics, staying in power, and slimming down state-owned enterprises in a way that does not create an industrial unrest and topple the CCP, because that's not on, obviously. So that very important political economy overcapacity problem is not being addressed by the tariffs. Now, you also made the point quite rightly that they were doubled from 25 to 50%. And as you said, essentially paraphrasing the president said, well, at 50%, foreign steel suppliers and aluminum suppliers won't get over the fence. Well, there we have it again. We don't want them to get over the fence. Why? Because we are trying to onshore or reshore under an autarkic, xenophobic trade policy, all of our production. Now, you also mentioned that our major suppliers are, in addition to Canada and Mexico, are the likes of Korea and Germany. These are not, traditionally anyway, foes. These are friends. And one of them, very importantly, India, one of the world's top 3 steel producers, China, India, and Japan, is an ally that we are, or at least a friend that we are trying to develop into an ally. Another part of your question, which really doesn't get enough attention, is the way in which the increase on the Section 232 tariffs occurred. They occurred on day 131 of this administration. And that is to say, the president announced he was doubling the tariffs on the 30th of May. That was day 131. They took effect at midnight today, which is day 135. That was sloppy. Stylistically, that was sloppy. Why? Because businesses were given very little notice as to what was happening, and they were given no document, no executive order, no proclamation on day 131. They had to wait 4 days until yesterday, basically, to get that proclamation when it finally went up on the whitehouse.gov website. Now, normally, the way trade policy would be done on a dramatic move like this is quietly, you'd have the U.S. trade representative with the commerce secretary huddling up, thinking about doubling the 232 tariffs, meeting then, expanding the circle a bit, perhaps including the Treasury Secretary and a few other administration officials, and then going to the president and saying, okay, let's do it. Or the president would say, I want you all to look at this possibility quietly. And then an executive order or proclamation would be drafted and industry would be consulted, quite possibly. Instead, the announcement was on social media. Then there's a 4 or 5 day hiatus. Industry's all upset, understandably. So are our foreign trade partners. They are worried. And then we get the proclamation. And by the way, during these 4 days, something very interesting happened. India announced with the European Union that was halfway through negotiating a free trade agreement, an Indo-European free trade agreement. Now, it cannot be stressed enough. What that means is in Delhi and in Brussels, they are looking at the U.S. as an unreliable trading partner. And one of their pieces of evidence is the chaos, as you put in your opening, with the Trump administration trade policy in style as well as in substance. So the long term, and it kind of goes back to your financial market question too. In the long term, many of our closest trading partners, like the Europeans, and like one we're trying to develop, India, are essentially decoupling is too strong a word, and diverting is even too strong a word. But right now, they are diversifying their trade away from the U.S. And think what happens to American exporters if the Indians and the Europeans secure an FTA the way India has already with the United Kingdom and Australia. Well, farmers and ranchers in Kansas and Missouri, where I am, they are at a competitive disadvantage because the margin of preference is going to be whatever the tariff the Indians and the Europeans put on as against zero for their own trade. So that's going to be one problem. And finally, let me take one other piece of your question, which is the effect on our local producers who are truly domestic that we're trying to help. And I want to use some two examples right here from Kansas City, and that's with beer. We have multiple good craft brewers. We've got Boulevard Beer, we've got Brookside Artisanals, we've got Casey Beer Company, Martin City Brewery. And guess what? They all need aluminum for their beer. And all of a sudden, a few days ago on day 131, they found out that their source of supply was going to go from 25% to 120 to 50% tariff. Okay. And then they're scrambling, and some of them are small and medium sized enterprises. They don't have high price counsel. They're trying to figure out, well, what do I do? Where do I get this aluminum from? How do I pay this tariff? Can I use a warehouse? Could I even use a foreign trade zone? They don't know. And so they're going to think, well, how do I price my beer this summer? Do I factor in a tariff? What amount of tariff? What price will my aluminum cost? Will the aluminum suppliers in Canada absorb some of that? What should the time frame of my supply contract be? Should I buy aluminum cans all the way through to for the Oktoberfest and the Christmas beer season, or should I just do it month to month? Tremendous uncertainty injected into the decision making of our wonderful local craft breweries.
And they are wonderful. I've been to Kansas City, and I can say that there was a pub there called Hurricane Alley, as I recall, way back when, or was it not Hurricane? Tornado Alley, maybe?
Yeah. I think that was it. Yep.
It's a haze. It's a fuzzy memory.
Well, if the tariffs don't crush these companies, we'll do a Truth to Power podcast live from the one of these breweries.
I would take you up on that. Absolutely. Let's talk about China, because you wrote the book on it. And Trump posted on Truth Social this morning at 2 a.m. that President Xi Jinping of China is a very tough man and very hard to do a deal with. And this is after Scott Bessent and the U.S. Trade Representative met with the Chinese delegation, the counterpart in Geneva, in the middle of May. They met over the weekend. They came out with a framework for doing a deal or framework for talks, and they agreed to back off the escalating tariffs from ridiculous levels to just extremely high levels. And the U.S. side said that China had agreed to some non-tariff relief on the rare earth minerals that are required for EV production and all kinds of other things, including advanced weapons. That has suddenly become a really big issue, not just for the US, but also for Europe and other countries, that China is holding back on these exports. There's been this talk that Xi and Trump might have a phone call this week to try to patch things up and get things on track. And I don't know what to make of the Truth Social post, except that perhaps a phone call isn't going to happen, or maybe it will. We just don't know. But it does look like Xi is playing a more hardball game than the White House anticipated.
Well, let's look at it for a second from President Xi's perspective. This deal, which was not a comprehensive deal at all, that was announced on day 113 of the Trump administration, that's the 12th of May. Everyone has seen around the world, including the Chinese authorities, how certain foreign leaders have been treated when they come to the Oval Office. Prime Minister Zelensky and the South African president as well, and perhaps some. And so, one thing that is very important, I think we all know, if we have any cultural competency in dealing with the Chinese, is the concept of face, not to be humiliated publicly. And I think you've written about that. You certainly know about it. And the Chinese look at this trade war, which was launched back in the first Trump administration in March of 2018, through the lens of the humiliation of the colonial period and the spheres of influence and the treaties of Nanjing going back to 1842, and the Opium Wars. And so they feel that if they just get on the phone and pick up the phone, like a good foreign leader relationship would be, you would say that they could, they're going to get ambushed the way the Ukrainian and South African leaders have, much less if they were to appear in the White House.
Sorry.
And the Chinese leaders are not confident that the Trump administration really understands this long-term historical perspective and the importance of this cultural competency in the style of negotiations. They know also the history back in the first Trump administration, how, for example, the Canadian Prime Minister, then Trudeau, and Canadian Trade Chrystia Freeland were treated in the USMCA negotiations. So when they did finally get to a deal, a non-comprehensive deal, yes, as you on day 113, yes, the U.S. did agree to lower its country-specific reciprocity tariff from upwards of 125% down to 10%, and then said it might lift them back up if no further agreement was reached to 35%. And then it retained its baseline reciprocity tariff of 10%, kept on the steel and aluminum tariffs, 25, now 50%, maintained 100% tariffs on electric vehicles and on solar products, which had been levied during the Biden interregnum. And the U.S. kept up its fentanyl and immigration tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, which I suspect we'll talk about soon. So, and there was no termination of the de minimis exemption for Chinese goods. Those tariffs remained in place. So what did China do? Well, China said, all right, we'll cut our 125% counter retaliatory threats down to 10%, kind of matching tit for tat, the de-escalation, if you will. And we'll suspend our export controls on 7 rare earths. But they didn't make any pledges on purchasing any more goods. They didn't make any pledges on state-centered economic policies. And they actually published a white paper on national security. Okay, so then why the Trump post that you mentioned, Mr. Xi's difficult to deal with, and China's reneging, and China said, we're reneging. Well, yes, by all reports, the licensing of exports of rare earths from Chinese ports has been slowed, kind of, dragging their feet on licensing those exports. That's from the American side. From the Chinese side, we have been slow in lowering our tariffs on Chinese goods. And of course, now we've increased the steel and aluminum ones. So, thinking for a second as a international law teacher, how do you solve this problem? And I think both sides got to step back a little bit and understand that there is legitimacy, their factual bases, their historical bases to the perspectives of the other side. And look at the importance of quiet negotiations. I mean, we've seen now 4.5 years, the first Trump administration, and now the first 6 months of the second Trump administration, of loud bullhorn diplomacy with Beijing. Has it worked? No. Is the trade war still being fought? Yes. Is the trade war even being fought, more ferociously with attempts to decouple? Yes. So a style change is certainly in order, and it's not a sign of weakness to be a little bit empathetic if you want to get to yes on a negotiation. And there are good points on both sides. And I might add one footnote here. In the meantime, that this chaos has been going on, China is considering its next made in China policy, its next 5-year plan, its next industrial policy that will take it through the next 5 years. That's something that the U.S. should want to help shape, so in a way that is favorable to the U.S. And right now, I don't see the U.S. having any input in Beijing into the next made in China policies.
These deals that the White House is talking about, they did reach a deal with the UK. They got Prime Minister Keir Starmer on the bullhorn in the Oval Office, and they announced it. And he was able to secure a carve out, or the 10 Downing Street was somehow, from these 50% steel tariffs, although they're still set at 25% for the UK. And the USTR is talking to the European Union about some sort of a European deal. What are your expectations for what those documents will ultimately look like? I mean, we expect them to be executive agreements, so that would imply that there may be some limits on what the U.S. can give. How do you see that playing out?
Well, to answer that first part of the question, I don't see them as being impressive at all. If we gauge an impressive bilateral trade agreement by the standards of the Clinton or George W. Bush administrations of being ambitious in the sense of broad and deep. And I see this playing out over a long time, nothing short. And here's why I say that. First of all, if the United States were serious about a comprehensive, again, ambitious in terms of breadth and depth, free trade agreement, the president would be seeking trade negotiating authority. And as you exactly rightly said, at best, this would be an executive agreement that would not require congressional approval. He's not seeking TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, or fast track. That expired in July of 2021, and his predecessor didn't seek it either. And in fact, it's a little bit ironic because one of the best ways to distinguish himself, Mr. Trump, from his predecessor, which he's obviously want to do, would be to get trade negotiating authority. And then he could do a truly comprehensive deal. Starting with the UK so-called economic prosperity deal, and I must poke a little bit of fun here. There's something about the naming in the Trump administrations of deals that is so underwhelming. United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. I mean, that could be an agreement about where to play NFL games, whether the Chiefs are going to play in Mexico City again. And likewise with economic prosperity deal. I mean, I kind of like some of our old logos like CAFTA and NAFTA and Chorus. But putting that aside, the US maintained under the UK economic prosperity deal its 10% reciprocity tariffs. So that's why some people say just think of 10% as the new normal. That's like our new baseline rate. The US did agree initially under the deal to exempt British origin steel and aluminum and derivatives from the tariffs. No 25%. So now, how is this a win for the UK as of last night at midnight? It gets 25% instead of 50% when the EPD said they'd get zero. That looks like a cave from Downing Street. The US said it would exempt in a limited way from the 25% Section 232 auto tariffs the first 100,000 of British autos imported into the US. Okay, that's about the volume, 100,000 British vehicles that have been coming into the US as in 2024. But after that, there's an overquota tariff of 27.5%. In other words, to be clear, the normal flow of British autos coming into the US, yes, it gets zero tariff, not 25%. But if the British want to increase beyond that 100,000 unit per year, they're going to get a higher tariff, not 25, but 27.5. Not exactly a great deal, I think, for the UK. The UK said it would purchase $10 billion worth of Boeing aircraft, including maybe about 30 787 Dreamliner planes. That's interesting because traditionally, pre-Brexit, the UK was part of the Airbus consortium. All right, and the US said, we'll give you, UK, some preferential treatment in all these upcoming Section 232 national security investigations: copper, lumber, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, medicines. Okay. Well, can you trust the word of the US on that? All right. Now, what did the UK get? What did the UK agree to? It basically cut its overall average tariffs, British tariffs on US goods, from 5.1% to 1.8%. Okay. That's pretty significant. 5 to 1 or 5 to 2%. It was still pretty low anyway. And most of those products, olive oil, sports equipment, wine, they matter. So and the UK said they would streamline customs processes for US goods. Okay, that's helpful. But what did the UK not agree to do? Alter its digital services tax. That's a big area of controversy between the US and the UK, and that remains at 2%, basically. That the DST that the UK collects from big tech companies. And overall, there was really nothing more than talk about more talk to expand this deal. And I might also point out, very importantly, the UK did not, and I say will not, weaken its sanitary and phytosanitary measures on food imports like beef that use growth hormones, or chicken, poultry that's washed with chlorine. All right, so that's just the UK. Now that UK should be the easy case, right? You asked about the EU coming. The UK should be the easy. We've got 27 members of the European Union.
Yeah, and I don't get the sense that they're eager to let Trump off the hook here.
They already have published their counter retaliation list.
The bazooka.
Yes, and it's going to be it's cleverly and predictably targeting Trump voting constituencies. So get ready, Kentucky bourbon. They're going to be hit. And given that you've got 27 nation states that make up the EU with different trade interests, getting an agreement that's anywhere close to a framework that's semi-ambitious is going to take time. And I might also point out, as you know, we've both been studying trade, students of trade for decades now. The idea of a US-UK FTA and the idea of a US EU FTA have been around for decades. I think it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, former Texas Senator Phil Gramm had looked at these possibilities back in the 80s or 90s. The ITC has studied them. So we've lost a lot of decades of time. Meanwhile, other trading partners or nations, be it Japan or Singapore or Mexico or Canada, have raced ahead with free trade agreements.
Mm-hmm. We've painted a pretty alarming picture here of Trump's trade policy as chaotic, damaging to the world economy and the U.S. economy, and and counterproductive. There have been a number of lawsuits, I think more than 10, by different organizations, small businesses, and a couple of rulings. The International Trade Court, the Court of International Trade, last week ruled that the Trump tariffs were the Liberation Day tariffs were unlawful. That his use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was beyond the scope of what Congress anticipated or provided for in the law. What what is your sense of so the state of play, as I understand it, is the administration appealed immediately to the the appeals circuit for the federal courts. The appeals circuit stayed the ruling temporarily pending the appeal, and so and then there are these other cases in the pipeline, as I mentioned, 10 of them, I think, that we could get a circuit split. We're likely to see this go to the Supreme Court under the heading of can courts review the president's determination of what an economic emergency is, and whether or not the trade court ruling is legitimate. I mean, it's a 50-page ruling. It's very detailed, but the administration has rejected it and said, well, even if we lose this case, we've got other ways to apply tariffs. How do you unravel all of this, and what should we expect to see happen?
Yeah. Okay. Great. I love the question. Great question. Lots to unravel here. Okay. So first off, on the last part of your question, this administration is dogged about its tariff policy, and even if, and it's highly hypothetical, the Supreme Court were to rule definitively that the president's use of the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, had exceeded his authority, the president has other statutory levers to impose reciprocity like tariffs. He's got a never use statute, Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, and that would empower him, possibly after an ITC, International Trade Commission investigation, to impose tariffs on countries that are deemed to discriminate, basically, treat the U.S. unfairly in trade. And he could use that. So he could use Section 338. He also could use Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. And Section 122 empowers the president to deal with a balance of payments problem, in this case, the trade imbalances, the trade deficits, by raising tariffs by up to 50% for 150 days, basically. So it's limited in how much he can raise the tariffs, and it's limited in how long he can raise them. And he could perhaps renew if he's able to work with Congress on renewal. So it's a little bit more of a constraint on him, but he could do that. He also could try and pull out Section 232 again with respect to some countries and saying they actually pose a national security threat. That would require, again, a Commerce Department investigation. The conclusion would probably be foregone. And at least he could do it on major commodities from certain countries, major products. His best solution would probably be a legislative one, whereby he simply has Congress, while his party is still in control of both houses, to pass a law that authorizes his use of the IEEPA for reciprocity tariffs. And that is a possibility as well. On the judicial decision that the Court of International Trade issued back on the 28th of May, first, a point of humility. I've been listening to various commentators, including trade professionals at major organizations and trade lawyers. They have been, several of them have said the CIT decision will be upheld by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in Washington, and if not, certainly by the Supreme Court. We don't know that. We are not constitutional lawyers. I'm not, and frankly, they're not. And the constitutional lawyers look at statutes not aspirationally the way free trade oriented lawyers would like them to look at and constrain the president's tariff raising policies under the IEPA. Instead, they're going to look carefully at the text of the IEPA. And I'll get into that in a second. But basically, what the CIT said in its holding was, first, under the Foreign Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, it's the Constitution that grants Congress, not the president, to levy tariffs. That's very clear in the Constitution, and they reaffirmed that. So no issue there. Second, the IEEPA statutory language authorizes the president to regulate importation, regulate imports. And the CIT said regulate imports does not mean impose tariffs, let alone unbounded tariffs. Well, I'm not sure about that, especially if I'm on the Supreme Court or the Court of Appeals. Now, I happen to have Black's Law Dictionary right here.
There it is.
There it is. And you know that the Supreme Court is dominated by textualists. And they're going to go to the Oxford English Dictionary. They're going to go to Black's Law Dictionary, especially the ones issued in 1977 when the IEPA was passed. And they're going to look at the words regulate and import. And let me just start with the word regulate. It says to control, to make a work at a regular speed or temperature. And regulation is control over something by rule or restriction. Well, control, make a rule or regulation, does not rule out imposing tariffs. It's open-ended. It's somewhat ambiguous. And so the court's going to look perhaps beyond that dictionary or lexicographic definition, saying, it's open. The president might have that power, and look to other sources like legislative history. So I don't know how they're going to rule on that. Now, the third holding of the CIT was that the president failed to prove trade deficits and, well, let's keep with trade deficits, are an unusual and extraordinary threat. Because the IEPA says the president can regulate trade against an unusual and extraordinary threat. Trade deficits are not unusual and extraordinary. And the CIT said, well, we've had these trade deficits, bilateral and global, every year for 49 years. Well, here's a counter argument that the Supreme Court might make. They are unusual and extraordinary, not if you take them in any one year, but if you take the aggregate, a half century of trade deficits is unusual and is extraordinary. They could make that argument at the appellate court of the Supreme Court. And then the final holding of the CIT is that levying tariffs on fentanyl and immigration does not deal with the unusual and extraordinary threat posed by fentanyl and immigration. The CIT didn't really get into whether or not illegal immigration or drug flows are unusual and extraordinary. They just said that tariffs don't deal with that threat? Well, I'm not so sure about that either. I could see the Supreme Court saying that's exactly what they're designed to deal with. They're trying to force Mexico City and Ottawa to take action. And in fact, Mexico City and Ottawa did take action. If we go back to January and February, President Sheinbaum and Prime Minister Trudeau did bolster their measures against fentanyl and illegal immigration. So they kind of worked to some extent. And I might also note that the CIT said that the political question doctrine does not rob it of subject matter jurisdiction, meaning that these are justiciable political questions that we can get into of the court. Well, the court, under what is now pretty talked about, it's been talked about since the George W. Bush administration. It's talked about in the movie Vice about Vice President Cheney, the unitary theory of the executive. If the Supreme Court says, look, the executive can do what it wants, especially on matters that are within the purview of the executive branch, national security, foreign policy, not trade, but national security and foreign policy, then we could see that we rule that this is a political question. And so we're not going to get into it. Overall, here's the big problem. And it's a fascinating intellectual and practical problem. Where does trade policy end and national security policy begin? The president's constrained by the Constitution under the Foreign Commerce Clause on trade policy. He needs delegated authority, and the delegation has to be subject to an intelligible principle that constrains him so he doesn't run amok. But on national security policy, there's a long history of case law from the Supreme Court on down that he has a lot of power. And it's almost a great question, for a law school exam. Where does trade policy end and foreign national security policy?
I feel a law review article coming.
Yeah, exactly. That's coming. Yeah. Hey, we got to do it together. So I think that there is no clear line there, and it'll be interesting how the Supreme Court draws it. But obviously, the way the Trump administration has been casting trade policy is that and this is how I would probably make the argument. Don't worry about trying to draw an impossible line between trade and national security policy, because trade policy is national security policy when it comes to proven adversaries like China, or proven threats like illegal immigration or narcotics, or threats that hollow out our industrial base like trade deficits. That the two are one.
So what I hear is that the courts are unlikely to provide guardrails or constraints on the president's ability to impose tariffs, as he has been, and that Congress would have to step up, which it hasn't, and hasn't. The politics of our country have shifted a lot since NAFTA and China MFN, and the World Trade Organization is almost a bad word on Capitol Hill. So I'm wondering, maybe to wrap it up here, it feels like we're witnessing somewhat of an unraveling of this 49-year history of reduction of trade barriers, expansion of free trade under U.S. leadership. How does the rest of the world interpret this, and what does this mean for the U.S. in terms of being a credible leader on the global stage?
If we're advising, foreign governments, foreign industry associations, trade exporters to the U.S., I think that there are a couple of bets I would put. One is the Sino-American trade war is not going to be resolved anytime soon. I had said back in March 2018, we're talking years, and we may be talking decades. So at least with respect to U.S.-China trade, can, plan on that being continually conflictual and plan on continued decoupling. Second, uh, view the Sino-American trade war as having expanded into a global trade war against friend and foe alike, so that the U.S., whatever great relationship the U.S. has had with a foreign country, be it Korea or Japan or Colombia, that doesn't matter anymore. That history doesn't matter anymore. We've seen this president threaten to remove or at least reduce the U.S. troop commitment on the DMZ in Korea. And we've seen him expect the Koreans to maybe pay more for their defense. And if you're making those kinds of gestures on something as important as the security of the Korean Peninsula, um, uh, a trade gesture is, just saying, forget it. We're not going to respect chorus, for example. It's pretty easy to do. So if you're the foreign party, you want to, again, kind of do in India, if you will, and diversify your exports, secure as many of your exports through free trade agreements outside of the U.S. You can't easily replace the U.S. market. It's too large with too great a purchasing power, but you do have other options to piece together. And if you're a country, say, other than India, say Korea, you may want to look at that billion-person market in India or the fast-growing markets of sub-Saharan Africa. Then another wrap-up point I would make is, sadly, don't look to the World Trade Organization, as you alluded to, for any help here. I don't see the appellate body coming back online, being resurrected anytime soon. The WTO has not produced any major agreements since really the fishing subsidies agreement and the customs trade facilitation agreement. And those are somewhat cafeteria plan agreements, which we can talk about on a different occasion. And if you just look at the activities of the WTO, they're sort of mind-numbingly, frustratingly mid-level. They're not major initiatives. So I would, to use a term back from the George W. Bush administration, if I'm, foreign power, I would look for coalitions of the willing and forge, plurilateral agreements on things you want. Like, for example, a carbon border adjustment mechanism that the EU is doing. I would partner with the EU on that. You got to, in other words, you got to secure your own trade interests, and you can't look to the U.S. or the WTO to help you with those. And then finally, I would say, Bill, and this is coming back to me as a lawyer, I would worry about the international rule of law, substantively and stylistically, because as we both know, the WTO and the FTAs like NAFTA were some of the most successful international agreements in human history. And they had real teeth. They had real binding dispute mechanisms, settlement mechanisms. They worked. And they have been, as I say in a forthcoming law review article, they've been shattered in these first 100 days. And they continue to be shattered in the 35 days after, now at day 135.
Raj, thank you very much. I knew there was a law review article in there somewhere. No, that was a tour de force, and thank you to our listeners for staying with us on that. It's a lot of detail, but I think trade policy is detailed policy, and unless you get into the weeds, as they say, it's hard to understand actually what's happening. And so this is very helpful, very insightful, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.